Blake had always found solace in order. His life, before the solicitor's unexpected call, was a carefully catalogued existence, each document filed, every digit accounted for. For years, his days unfolded within the quiet hum of the city archives, surrounded by the comforting scent of aged paper and dry ink. He was a man who understood the geometry of information, the precise placement of facts. Ambiguity was an anomaly he systematically corrected. The news of the inheritance had arrived like a misplaced decimal point in his otherwise perfect ledger. A remote monastery, he'd been told, nestled deep within a forgotten valley, miles from the nearest paved road. It was a family legacy, though Blake had known precious little about that side of his lineage, his own parents having been rather tight-lipped about anything predating their own unremarkable lives. The monastery belonged to a distant relative, a great-uncle he'd never met, a recluse whose passing had finally released the property from its long, silent vigil. He remembered the first glimpse of it, a hulking silhouette against a bruised sky, rising from the mist-shrouded hills like a fossilized leviathan. The journey there had been arduous, a winding dirt track that seemed to actively resist his passage, branches clawing at the rental car's paintwork. When he finally cut the engine, the silence that descended was profound, a heavy blanket woven from the absence of birdsong, wind, and human sound. It felt less like an arrival and more like an absorption. The structure itself was immense, built from dark, rough-hewn stone that seemed to drink the light. Moss softened the sharp edges of ancient carvings above the arched doorway, depicting what looked like stylized constellations and twisting, unidentifiable flora. Inside, the remote monastery was a labyrinth of echoing corridors and cavernous rooms. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the tall, narrow windows, illuminating the vast emptiness. Cobwebs, thick and gray, draped from every high ceiling like morbid tapestries. The floorboards groaned under his sensible shoes, each step a declaration in the pervasive quiet. Blake, for all his meticulous nature, felt a peculiar sense of disarray here, an unraveling of the precise logic he held so dear. It was as if the very air pulsed with untold stories, a static charge of history. He could almost feel the weight of generations pressing down, silent observers to his intrusion. His initial task, as outlined by the solicitor, was simple: assess the contents, identify anything of value, and prepare the estate for eventual sale. This wasn't merely an old building, it was a vast, complicated mechanism, dormant but not entirely inert. He found himself listening, not for specific sounds, but for the absence of them, for the subtle shifts in the profound quiet. Days bled into a week. He organized his temporary living quarters in a relatively less dilapidated wing, methodically unpacking his few belongings. He ate his meager meals alone, the clink of his fork against the plate sounding unnaturally loud. It was during one of his exploratory forays that he found it. The air inside was thick, stagnant, tasting of decay and an almost metallic tang he couldn't identify. The room was immense, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves, each groaning under the weight of countless tomes and scrolls. But it wasn't the books that caught his professional eye. It was the flat files, stacked like forgotten monoliths in the center of the room, and the large, wooden map cases lining one entire wall. Blake's breath hitched. Here, in this remote, forgotten place, was a cartographer's treasure trove. He approached the map cases, his fingers tracing the cool, smooth wood. These weren't standard filing cabinets, they were custom-built, clearly designed for precious cargo. With a gentle pull, he opened the top drawer. Inside, rolled tightly and tied with brittle, faded ribbons, lay dozens of maps. He carefully selected one, unrolling it on a nearby dusty table. It was a map of the known world, or so it seemed at first glance. Beautifully rendered, with hand-drawn coastlines and intricate compass roses. But as Blake leaned closer, his archivist's eye immediately snagged on the discrepancies. The geography was subtly wrong in places, islands existing where none should be, continental shapes distorted just enough to be unsettling. And then there were the symbols. Tiny, recurring motifs etched into the margins, bordering the oceans, even integrated into the decorative flourishes of the title. They were geometric, yet organic, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if he stared too long. He recognized none of them from any historical cartography text. Some resembled twisted knots, others, constellations that had never graced the night sky. He carefully re-rolled the first map and reached for another, and then another. Each one presented the same disquieting anomalies. A celestial chart depicted impossible planetary alignments and unknown stellar bodies. A regional map showed a mountain range in a place where only flat plains existed, its peaks crowned with the same strange symbols. The patterns were always there, subtle at first, then more pronounced, like a recurring fever dream rendered in ink. This wasn't just a collection, it was a narrative, unfolding across centuries, across continents that never were. His meticulously ordered world, built on verifiable facts and tangible evidence, began to fray at the edges. He was no longer merely assessing an estate, he was standing at the threshold of a secret, meticulously preserved, and profoundly unsettling. The remote monastery had not merely inherited him, it had begun to claim him. The remote monastery, ancient and imposing, settled around Blake like a shroud woven from stone and silence. Now, a palpable weight pressed in from the thick walls, a stillness that hummed with something beyond mere quiet. He spent the first days establishing a rudimentary workspace in what appeared to be the main library, a vast, echoing chamber lined floor to ceiling with oak shelves, their contents largely obscured by shadow and the accumulated grime of centuries. The air tasted of dust, mildew, and something else, something metallic and faint, like rust dissolving on the tongue. Blake, ever the archivist, found a peculiar comfort in the sheer volume of material. His purpose, as outlined by the solicitor, was clear: catalog the estate's legendary collection of maps and charts. He began with the oldest, unrolling them carefully on a massive, scarred table beneath the single, tall window that offered a meager allowance of the afternoon's pallid light. Each sheet of vellum or heavy paper, brittle with age, exhaled the faint, sweet scent of forgotten voyages and bygone empires. Initially, his work was a pure intellectual delight. He identified charts from the age of exploration, intricate celestial diagrams hand-drawn by unknown astronomers, and detailed topographical surveys of regions long since swallowed by forest or sea. He noted the exquisite calligraphy, the vibrant pigments, the painstaking accuracy of coastlines and mountain ranges. These were testaments to human ingenuity, triumphs of observation and draftsmanship. He felt a familiar, deep satisfaction as he meticulously logged each item, noting its provenance, estimated date, and condition. The first tremor of unease arrived subtly, almost imperceptibly, within a meticulously rendered map of the North Atlantic, dated circa 1680. Blake was admiring the decorative cartouche, a swirling vortex of sea creatures and cherubs, when his gaze snagged on a minute detail. Tucked away within the finial of a stylized compass rose, barely larger than a fly speck, was a symbol. It was abstract, geometric yet organic, resembling a knot of impossible angles that seemed to write even as he stared. It didn't belong. It wasn't a known cartographic mark, nor a printer's device. He leaned closer, squinting. The line work was too precise, too alien for the florid Baroque style surrounding it. He dismissed it, momentarily, as an idiosyncratic engraver's flourish, a private joke or a cryptic signature. But the image lodged itself in his mind, a tiny burr of incongruity. Days bled into a week. Blake's routine solidified: rise with the week dawn, descend to the library, work until his eyes ached in the fading light, then retreat to his sparse quarters. The second anomaly presented itself within a series of charts depicting the Pacific Ocean, ostensibly from the late 18th century. These were breathtaking in their scope, showing currents and depths with an almost prophetic understanding. But then he saw it, an archipelago, sprawling and jagged, positioned precisely where the vast, empty expanse of the Southern Ocean should be. The islands were unlike any he knew, their contours too sharp, their arrangement too deliberate, like a fractured puzzle piece that refused to fit. He consulted his atlases, his digital archives, his encyclopedic knowledge of world geography. Nothing. No record, no historical account, no geological possibility for such a landmass. It was as if an entire continent had been conjured from imagination and then meticulously rendered onto a map claiming factual accuracy. He ran his fingers over the vellum, feeling the raised ink of mountains that should not exist. He found another such impossible geography, a great, inland sea twisting through the heart of what should have been an arid desert in North Africa, complete with strange, monolithic structures rising from its shores. Then another, a continent-sized landmass south of Australia, its coastline a labyrinth of impossible fjords and promontories, labeled with script that defied any known language. His archivist's certainty, his meticulous belief in documented reality, began to buckle. Then came the sigil. It wasn't a single discovery, but a slow, horrifying realization that emerged like a pattern from a hidden tapestry. He found it first on a chart of the Arctic Circle, nestled within the icy whirls of an uncharted current. It was the same symbol he'd dismissed earlier, the impossible knot of angles, geometric yet disturbingly organic. A few days later, it appeared again, subtly woven into the decorative border of a map detailing the coast of Greenland. Then, within the waves of a Caribbean sea chart. Each time, it was small, almost hidden, requiring a deliberate act of looking to discern it. But once seen, it could not be unseen. It wasn't merely a recurring motif, it was identical in every iteration, drawn with the same unnerving precision, a visual echo across centuries and continents. It wasn't a known symbol of any culture, ancient or modern. It pulsed with an alien geometry, a visual paradox that seemed to shift slightly at the periphery of his vision. Then, most unsettlingly, almost imperceptibly, within the swirling pattern of a storm cloud depicted over the estate itself on a local survey map from the early 19th century. His breath hitched, a dry catch in his throat. This wasn't a cartographer's error, nor an artistic flourish. This was deliberate. A recurring, anachronistic symbol appearing on impossible geographies across hundreds of years and disparate cultures. The meticulously ordered world Blake had carefully constructed around himself began to fracture, revealing a glimpse of something vast and utterly unsettling beneath. He worked in the vast, echoing library, a space dominated by towering shelves that reached to a vaulted ceiling, each creaking under the burden of forgotten texts and rolled charts. Blake had spread several of the more peculiar maps across a heavy oak table, their brittle parchment rustling softly as he adjusted them. The recurring symbols, once mere curiosities, now felt like persistent whispers. They appeared on charts depicting familiar coastlines, yet rendered mountain ranges that defied geology, and rivers that flowed uphill into impossible lakes. A draft snaked around his ankles, icy and sudden, despite the complete absence of any open windows or discernible cracks in the thick stone. Blake shivered, pulling his sweater tighter. Nothing. The quiet hummed back, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. He dismissed it as an old building settling, a trick of the ancient stone. But then, a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound drifted from the floor above, a sound like heavy furniture being dragged across bare flagstones. He froze, listening intently. It stopped. He returned his attention to the maps, trying to shake off the creeping unease. He was being fanciful. The isolation was getting to him. He focused on a particularly elaborate chart, ostensibly of a European coastline, but riddled with impossible landmasses and spiral patterns that seemed to ripple off the edges of the parchment. He placed another map beside it, this one a celestial chart of star constellations he vaguely recognized, yet here, too, impossible stars shone, connected by lines that formed geometric shapes unknown to any astronomy he knew. And there, starkly present on both, were the symbols. The intricate, almost biological patterns. The strange, multi-limbed figures. It felt cool, raised, almost wet, despite the dry age of the parchment. His skin prickled. This wasn't just artistic license or archaic cartography. The symbols were too consistent, too precise across different maps, different eras. They were a language. An alien language. He turned abruptly, his heart thudding against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, pushing back against the rising panic. Focus, Blake. This is a mystery, not a haunting. He pulled a magnifying glass from his satchel, examining the symbols with renewed determination. The more he looked, the more he saw. Faint lines, almost invisible to the naked eye, connecting the symbols, forming networks. These weren't just decorative elements, they were integral to the maps themselves. He began to overlay the maps, one translucent sheet over another. The impossible landmasses on the earthly maps aligned perfectly with the impossible constellations on the celestial charts. The spiral patterns on one chart were the same spirals that emanated from the unknown stars on another. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the data. These maps weren't depicting Earth as he knew it. They weren't depicting any known celestial sphere. They were depicting something else entirely. A hidden geography. A non-Euclidean reality, perhaps, where dimensions folded back on themselves, where space was not merely empty distance but a canvas for impossible geometries. The symbols were not just a language, but the very syntax of this alien topography. A faint shimmer caught his eye, a fleeting distortion in the air near the high, arched doorway. For a split second, the stone archway seemed to waver, its ancient lines blurring as if seen through rising heat or water. Then it solidified, ancient and unmoving. Blake blinked, rubbing his eyes. His mind was playing games. The isolation, the lack of sleep, the sheer strangeness of his discoveries, it was all starting to wear him down. But the feeling of being watched intensified. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, from directly above him, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged and dropped, dragged and dropped. It wasn't the sound of an old building settling. It was too deliberate. Too close. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly on the stone floor, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vast room. He strained his ears, every muscle tensed. The thumping stopped. The scraping ceased. He wasn't just an archivist anymore. He was an accidental trespasser, caught between realities, and something within the remote monastery was very much aware of his presence. Blake felt it in the dry air, in the way the dust motes seemed to hang suspended, reluctant to settle. His determination, however, was a sharp, unyielding point against the monastery's oppressive calm. These earlier charts, though strange, possessed a certain antique charm. What he sought now, he felt, would lack any such veneer. He navigated by the dim glow of his lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceilings, heavy with scrolls and leather-bound volumes. At the very end of a narrow, seldom-used corridor, behind a false panel disguised as a stack of crumbling theological texts, he found them. A wooden chest, crudely fashioned and bound with tarnished brass, lay hidden. These were not the meticulous works of a dedicated archivist. These were the fevered scratchings of a mind teetering on the brink. Blake carefully extracted the first journal. Its pages, thin as onion skin, crackled under his touch. The ink, faded to sepia, was applied with an agitated hand, the script often blurring into illegibility. He recognized the family crest, a stylized compass rose, but the name inscribed beneath it was one he barely knew, a distant ancestor, an obscure branch of the family tree, Elias. The dates spanned a period over 2 centuries ago, detailing a slow, agonizing descent. Elias's early entries were academic, concerned with the precise charting of terrestrial anomalies. But as Blake turned the pages, the tone shifted. The language grew increasingly desperate, the handwriting more erratic, slanting wildly across the lines. Elias wrote of the impossible geographies, of patterns that defy the very fabric of space. He spoke of the pressure from beyond. Elias's maps, folded haphazardly between journal pages, were even more disturbing. They were not merely anachronistic, they were utterly alien. They depicted a reality that was actively trying to break through, and Elias was, by turns, documenting it and fighting it. "It breathes," one entry scrawled in thick, black ink declared, "beneath the very stones. I hear its hunger, a silent roar that vibrates through the bedrock. I have drawn the boundaries, built the walls, but it pushes. It yearns for an open door." Another, almost illegible, spoke of the great unraveling, and a desperate plea to hold the line. The last few pages were a chaotic mess of overlapping symbols and fragmented sentences, punctuated by crude, desperate sketches of impossible geometries that seemed to writhe on the page. He had become obsessed, a guardian driven to the precipice of sanity by the very thing he sought to understand and contain. As Blake read, the air in the small, dusty alcove grew strangely heavy. The metallic scent intensified, now mingled with something acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike. A low, resonant hum, imperceptible at first, began to vibrate through the soles of his boots, rising from the monastery's deep foundations. He tried to dismiss it as the ancient building settling, or perhaps his own imagination, overwrought by Elias's terrifying confessions. He looked up from the journal, his breath catching. The stone wall opposite him, solid and ancient, began to shimmer. The very texture of the rock seemed to distort, its rough-hewn surface rippling like water. It was not a hole, but an absence, a window into a space that defied perception. The hum intensified, vibrating through his bones, and the aperture pulsed, expanding slightly, as if breathing. Blake slumped against the bookshelf, his hands trembling, the brittle journal pages rustling softly. His mind reeled, grappling with the sheer impossibility of what he had witnessed. Was it a hallucination, a trick of his exhausted mind, fueled by the ancestors' madness? Or had the monastery, the estate, the very ground beneath him, truly opened a momentary glimpse into the terrifying truth that lay beneath? The line between reality and nightmare had not just blurred, it had dissolved entirely. He was no longer just an archivist seeking answers, he was a witness, and perhaps a new guardian, or a new victim, of the entity that stirred beneath his feet. The remote monastery, ancient and imposing, had ceased to be merely a place Blake occupied. Now, it felt like an extension of his own increasingly frayed nerves. He had spent the last 2 days closeted in the scriptorium. A frigid chamber lined with crumbling frescoes and shelves laden with brittle scrolls, the air thick with the scent of old paper and something else, a dry, mineral tang that pricked at his throat. His fingers, stained with ancient dust and ink, traced the impossible lines on a massive parchment unrolled across the worn oak table. This was a chart of the North Atlantic, yet its landmasses were distorted, stretched, and folded in ways no cartographer, even in the most speculative age, could have conceived. Here, a phantom island pulsed with a network of strange, veiny lines. There, the coastline of a familiar continent rippled into an intricate geometric pattern, utterly alien. He had been so focused on the anachronisms, the impossible geographies, that he'd missed the true horror. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the vellum. The recurring patterns, these strange sigils he'd initially dismissed as stylistic flourishes or corrupted symbols, were far more deliberate. They weren't just on the maps, they were the maps in some fundamental way. He noticed a subtle shift in their design, almost imperceptible, from one chart to the next, like a language evolving. Some were bold, almost aggressive in their angularity, others were delicate, almost skeletal, resembling microscopic structures. But they all pointed, in their own esoteric way, to specific points. A chill, not from the monastery's damp stone, feathered up his spine. He recalled a particularly unsettling map from his own estate's collection, one depicting a vast, unnamed ocean, its depths rendered not with waves but with swirling vortexes of these very symbols. He'd thought it a fantastical depiction of currents. Now, a more sinister interpretation clawed at his mind. As the charts overlapped, a horrifying congruence emerged. The seemingly random sigils coalesced, forming larger, more complex structures that weren't just marking points on the map, but seemed to be defining the very fabric of the map's reality. They weren't just charting influences, they were channeling them. The lines weren't borders but conduits. The symbols weren't labels but instructions. A low hum, barely perceptible, seemed to vibrate through the stone floor beneath his feet. Or perhaps it was only the thrumming in his own head, a growing pressure behind his eyes. The maps weren't passive records, they were blueprints. Tools. His gaze snapped to a small, intricate chart of a coastal region, nestled amongst the larger ones. It was ancient, its edges frayed, the ink faded to sepia. But there, undeniably, was a familiar coastline, a specific promontory, and a distinct, isolated landmass. His estate. The symbols around his estate on this map were not merely descriptive. They were the most intricate, the most potent, the most active of all the symbols he'd encountered. They coiled and writhed like living things, converging upon the central point where his home stood. The impossible geographies, the anachronistic symbols, the recurring patterns, they weren't just charting where the veil between dimensions was thin. They were charting where it could be torn. His estate, with its impossible collection, was not just located near a nexus. It was the nexus. A primary gateway. His ancestors hadn't just been cartographers. They had been guardians, yes, but of what? And with what intent? The symbols on the maps didn't just warn, they invited. They didn't just contain, they facilitated. They was his family lineage, one of vigilant protectors, or, infinitely more terrifying, one of generations of cultists, meticulously maintaining the conditions for something ancient and unspeakable to breach reality? The air in the scriptorium grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He heard a faint scratching sound, like claws on stone, from somewhere deep within the monastery's walls, or perhaps it was just the rats. But it sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic. The maps, spread out before him like a horrifying tapestry of intent, now seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light, visible only to him. And he was standing on the precipice of its unfolding. Sleep offered no true respite, only vivid, disorienting dreams that dissolved upon waking, leaving behind a residue of dread. He was no longer meticulously cataloging, he was hunting, driven by a gnawing certainty that the answers were here, buried deeper than any map, hidden behind a truth too terrible to contemplate. His gaze now lingered on the physical structure of the remote monastery itself. He had walked these corridors 100 times, but always with the detached eye of an archivist. Now, he saw anomalies. A section of the library wall, though plastered and painted like the rest, seemed to absorb light differently, a subtle deadness to its surface. It was too perfect, too seamless, for an old building. The stonework here was known for its irregularities, its proud, rough-hewn character. This stretch was an impostor. A thrill of icy certainty ran through him, cutting through the fog of his exhaustion. He fetched a small chisel and a mallet from his toolkit, his hands steady despite the tremor in his stomach. It was a door, almost perfectly camouflaged, its seams packed with a fine, gray mortar. With a grunt, he pressed it, and a faint click, like a bone snapping, resonated through the wall. The hidden section of the wall swung inward with a low, groaning sigh, displacing the stale air within the newly revealed opening. He recoiled slightly, the smell clinging to his nostrils. Blake hesitated at the threshold, a sudden surge of primal fear clamping down on his resolve. This was it. The point of no return. He grabbed a lantern from a nearby shelf, its glass chimney clinking against the brass frame, and ignited the wick. He stepped through, pulling the hidden door shut behind him with a soft thud that seemed to seal him off from the world above. The passage opened into a circular chamber, its walls carved directly into the bedrock, unadorned and ancient. In the center, a rough stone altar stood, scarred and stained. Dried, twisted roots formed a grotesque effigy, bound with rusted iron wire. But what truly drew his eye, lying open on a stone lectern beside the altar, was a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The script was an ancestor's, familiar from the marginalia in the maps, but here, it was frantic, sprawling, sometimes barely legible. Blake picked it up, his fingers trembling, and brought the lantern closer. The ancestor, a guardian named Alaric, had written of a breach, a rending of the veil. He spoke not of a physical entity. It twists the mind, corrupts the senses, until reality itself becomes its sustenance. Our maps were not merely records, but traps, conduits, and ultimately, warnings. Blake's eyes scanned the frantic entries, his own mind reeling. Alaric described generations of his lineage, not as cultists. As desperate custodians, attempting to chart the entity's subtle incursions, to contain its influence within the very symbols that now haunted Blake. We drew its patterns to understand them, to predict its points of entry, hoping to bind it, to keep it from manifesting fully into our world, but it learns. It adapts. It uses them. Our attempts to contain it have only shown it the way. The maps. They are not safeguards. They are invitations. It is here, now, beneath this very stone. It listens. It waits for the mind to fray, for the perception to warp. It is not an invasion of force, but of truth and I. I have failed. The final seal. It has broken. The monastery. It breathes its breath now. There is no escape, only dissolution. The journal slipped from Blake's numb fingers, clattering onto the cold stone floor. The metallic scent in the air intensified, coppery and thick. It was already here. It had been here for generations, quietly feeding, patiently waiting. And now, Blake, the meticulous archivist, had not merely found the door to its prison, he had helped pry it open. The journal lay splayed on the cold flagstones, its ancient vellum pages rippling in the sudden, sharp draft. Blake stared at it, his own breath misting in the frigid air that now permeated the archive. A profound, sickening cold had settled deep in his bones, not merely the chill of the unheated room, but an internal frost that made his teeth ache. He refused to yield. Blake bent, retrieving the journal with a hand that trembled despite his resolve. He clutched it, the rough leather a grounding force. He was an archivist, a man of order and logic, and even this unfolding horror would be catalogued, dissected, understood. The house, however, seemed to mock his determination. A low groan reverberated through the very stones, a sound too deep for settling timber, too organic for mere wind. Dust motes, previously still, began to dance in the lantern light, swirling in impossible eddies, defying the still air. A stack of scrolls on a nearby shelf slid, not falling, but gliding an inch to the left before settling back with a soft hiss of parchment. Blake watched, jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the journal. He saw it, plain as day. No trick of light, no tired eyes. At first, they were faint, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty expanse, just beyond the edge of hearing, a murmur of sound that held no discernible words, only an endless sibilance. They coiled around him, rising from the floorboards, seeping from between the spines of ancient tomes. They weren't in any language he knew, yet they carried the weight of meaning, of malice. He could almost discern patterns in the sound, impossible geometries of noise forming and dissolving. A familiar silhouette of a tall bookcase would suddenly twist, its solid oak frame seeming to bend and stretch into a grotesque, elongated shape, only to snap back into normalcy when Blake blinked. His gaze fell upon a heavy, leather-bound volume tucked away behind a loose panel in the wall. It was not a map, nor a celestial chart, but a ledger, its cover embossed with a symbol he recognized from the anachronistic maps, a spiraling knot of lines that seemed to devour itself. Inside, the script was an older hand, careful and precise. It detailed shipments, dates, and names, but not of goods or people. It recorded coordinates, celestial alignments, and rituals. Blake's breath hitched. The ledger detailed a series of events, culminating in a specific date, centuries ago, a date that coincided with the first appearance of the impossible geographies on the maps. As he read, the ledger itself seemed to change. The ink on the page shimmered, and for a terrifying instant, the precise lines of script twisted into a swirling vortex, a miniature black hole consuming the very paper. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the ancient, faded words. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, rising from the very foundations of the estate. It wasn't the settling of an old house, it was the sound of something vast and powerful stirring directly beneath him. The walls of the alcove seemed to pulse, a subtle, rhythmic throb that he could feel in his teeth. The air grew heavy, pressing in on him, making it difficult to draw a full breath. The entity wasn't just observing anymore, it was reacting. It was hostile. It was here. And the remote monastery, whatever its true purpose, was key. He would not stop. He could not. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, an almost painful prick at the back of his throat, a scent that now seemed to fill his very lungs, coating his tongue. He tore his gaze from the chilling air and focused on the journal splayed before him. Its vellum pages, brittle and yellowed, had a strange, almost oily sheen under the flickering lantern light. His fingers, trembling slightly, traced the elegant, archaic script. He ignored it, his mind a frantic scramble for understanding. The previous entries had been warnings, fragmented observations of impossible geographies and shifting realities. This page, however, was different. It spoke not of observation, but of action. The ancestor's hand, though long dead, seemed to guide his eyes. The words were a dizzying mix of arcane terms and stark instructions, a terrible recipe for containment. Blake had to reread passages multiple times, his brain struggling to reconcile the impossible with the terrifyingly real. It detailed a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble to seal the breach. It wasn't about destroying the entity, the journal made clear, but about pushing it back, forcing the door shut, at least temporarily. The key, the text insisted, lay beneath the estate itself, within the oldest foundations, a place it referred to cryptically as the heart of the remote monastery. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He'd always known the estate was ancient, but a monastery? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. The maps, he realized, weren't just showing the entity's movements, they were also a record of the Guardian's attempts to contain it, a generational struggle etched in distorted lines and impossible landmasses. The recurring patterns he'd obsessively catalogued, they weren't just symbols of the entity's influence, but fragments of the ritual itself, scattered and hidden in plain sight. The journal described a convergence point, a nexus where the veil between worlds was thinnest, and where the entity pushed hardest. To reach it, he would need to decipher a sequence of symbols hidden within the estate's architecture, unlocking passages known only to the chosen few. And once there, the ritual demanded a terrible price. His ancestor had written of a binding of blood and truth, a final act of will to reinforce the barrier. It required the manipulation of the primary celestial chart, the largest and most complex map in the entire collection, the one depicting a sky that had never existed, constellations that writhed with impossible geometries. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the flagstones, rising from somewhere deep beneath him. The sound wasn't like thunder, it was deeper, more organic, like the grinding of colossal, ancient bones. Blake gripped the journal tighter, his knuckles white. The text specified that the chart, once manipulated, needed to be anchored to the convergence point, the heart of the remote monastery, and sealed with a living sacrifice. Not a life taken, but a life given. His own. It was a permanent commitment, a surrender of his own future, tethering himself to the containment, becoming a living lock. He imagined the act, pressing his palm, freshly cut, onto the impossibly vast chart, allowing his blood to seep into the parchment, tracing the lines of the counter-ritual, becoming one with the impossible geography. It wasn't just a physical sacrifice, it was a spiritual one. His mind would be forever linked to the entity's prison, a constant sentinel, a living part of the seal. The ancestor had called it the final vigil, a promise of eternal vigilance against the breach. He would never be truly free again, never truly himself. A gust of icy wind swept through the archive, though no windows were open. It carried with it the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay, mingling with the metallic tang. The house groaned around him, a mournful, drawn-out sound that seemed to come from its very foundations. Blake closed his eyes for a moment, pressing the journal against his chest. The choice was stark: succumb to the creeping horror, let it consume him and the world, or become its eternal jailer. His life, as he knew it, was already over. His meticulous, ordered existence had been shattered. Now, he faced a different kind of order, a terrifying, sacred duty. He opened his eyes, a grim resolve hardening his features. He was an archivist, a keeper of records. Now, he would be a keeper of the impossible. He scanned the page again, looking for the first step. To access the heart, the journal read, "Seek the sun's inverse." Etched in stone where the sky meets the earth, beneath the eye of the forgotten saint. Blake looked up, his gaze sweeping the ornate, dust-laden ceiling of the archive, then down to the ancient, uneven flagstones. The sun's inverse. Where the sky meets the earth. The forgotten saint. Cryptic, maddening, yet he knew, with a horrifying certainty, that the answers were all around him, waiting to be found within the very fabric of his family's cursed inheritance. It clung to his tongue, coated his throat, and deepened with every strained breath he took inside the ancient, dust-choked walls of the remote monastery. The smell of fresh soil, turned over after a long winter, had intensified too, morphing into something richer, almost fecund, like earth disturbed by something vast and burrowing. He felt it not just in his nose, but in the vibrations humming faintly through the flagstones beneath his worn boots. He had expected stillness, the quiet decay of forgotten faith. Instead, the monastery pulsed with a low, resonant thrum, a sound that bypassed his ears and settled directly in his chest, rattling his ribs. Moonlight, fractured by the grimy lancet windows, painted stripes across the nave, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the charged air. His hand, clutching the worn leather-bound volume of ancestral etchings, trembled not from cold, but from a deeper tremor that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the structure. This was it. The culmination of the impossible geographies, the anachronistic symbols, the whispers in the dark corners of the estate. The maps had led him here, to this specific, desolate point, a nexus of forgotten lines and impossible intersections. It wasn't quite a perfect circle, but warped, elongated in places, like a ripple in stone. This was the focus. These were the tools, prescribed by the archaic annotations in the margins of the final, most disturbing chart. Blake knelt, the rough stone biting into his knees. He placed the bowl precisely at the center of the warped circle. His fingers, despite their tremor, were meticulous as he crumbled the herbs into the bowl, their sharp, acrid scent cutting through the metallic earthiness. Next, the obsidian shard. He laid it flat, reflecting the fractured moonlight like a pool of ink. The thrumming intensified, vibrating up his spine, making his teeth ache. He fought it, focusing on the cadence of the ritual words, letting them be his anchor against the encroaching madness. He was determined, a fragile vessel holding back an ocean. Then, the manifestation began. It wasn't a shape, not a form he could delineate with his eyes. Instead, it was an absence that was also a presence, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, centered above the obsidian shard. Colors bled from the stone walls, draining into the focal point, leaving them a dull, flat gray. The fractured moonlight seemed to stretch and distort, bending around an invisible mass. Blake gasped, the chant faltering. What he saw defied logic, defying the very laws of perception. It was like looking at a wound in the world, a glimpse into something that was not meant to be. He felt his sanity fraying, a thin thread stretched to breaking. It wants to unravel everything. With a primal scream that was swallowed by the monastery's echoing vastness, Blake forced himself to continue the ritual. He picked up a small, polished stone from his pocket, one he had found nestled within the final map's folds. He pressed it against the obsidian shard, the final step. As the stone met the shard, a blinding flash of light erupted, not outward, but inward, drawing the distorted light and color into the focal point. The roar in his mind sharpened into a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and frustration that threatened to split his skull. Blake felt a violent tug, as if his very soul was being pulled into the shimmering tear. He clung to the stone, to the ground, to his rapidly dissolving sanity. He pushed back, pouring every ounce of his will, every desperate prayer, every ancestral memory of guardianship into the ritual. He envisioned the lines on the maps, the symbols, not as pathways in, but as barriers, as seals. The monastery groaned, stone grinding against stone. Dust rained down from the ceiling. He could feel the entity's immense power, its ancient fury, fighting him, trying to break his concentration, to rip him apart, mind and body. But Blake held fast, his teeth gritted, his eyes squeezed shut, the final incantation a desperate, raw rasp in his throat. He was sealing it, pushing it back, closing the door that his ancestors had guarded, or perhaps opened, for so long. The fate of his mind, a fragile shield against the incomprehensible, hung by a thread. The primal scream had ripped from Blake's throat, a raw, guttural sound that tore at his vocal cords even as it was swallowed by the remote monastery's vast, echoing space. He had clutched the smooth, dark stone, its warmth a strange counterpoint to the cold dread that had seized him. He remembered pressing it into the intricate central knot of the final, pulsating map spread across the altar-like stone slab. Now, only the lingering scent of ozone and something acrid, like burnt dust and ancient, decaying metal, hung heavy in the air. Blake lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, every muscle screaming in protest. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and a thin, metallic taste coated his tongue. He pushed himself up slowly, his limbs stiff, joints grinding like rusty gears. The air, though still thick with the aftermath, no longer hummed with that insidious, almost liquid tension. The immediate threat, he realized with a shudder that ran bone deep, was gone for now. He scanned the cavernous chamber. The stone slab where the ritual had unfolded was cracked, a jagged fissure running through its center, radiating outwards like a spiderweb. The final map, the one he had painstakingly pieced together, was gone, not burnt or torn, but simply absent, as if it had never existed. The polished stone he had used was gone too, vanished without a trace. Blake stumbled to his feet, his balance precarious. He felt as though he had been stretched, pulled taut, and then snapped back, leaving him irrevocably altered. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of profound exhaustion, a weariness that seeped into his very marrow. He walked towards the gaping archway, his steps echoing loudly in the sudden, absolute quiet. He squinted against the pale dawnlight, the world seeming too bright, too sharp. He walked for hours, the rough terrain a constant challenge to his battered body. His mind, however, was clearer than it had been in weeks, terrifyingly so. The fragments of knowledge, once fleeting and elusive, now coalesced into a horrific tapestry. He understood the ancestors' grim duty, the generations of quiet vigil. He had pushed it back. He had bought time. But at what cost? The house looked different. Not overtly damaged, but subtly wrong. The air around it felt stagnant, heavy, as if the very atmosphere had been wrung dry of vitality. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The house was unnervingly quiet. It no longer hummed with its subtle, ancient life. It was a tomb. He moved through the grand halls, his footsteps unnaturally loud. The vast collection of maps and charts, once his obsession, now seemed inert, their intricate lines and impossible geographies nothing more than faded ink on brittle parchment. The insidious patterns, the anachronistic symbols, had vanished from his perception. The maps were just maps again. But the scars remained. He ran a hand over a mahogany table, feeling the fine layer of dust that coated everything. The house felt emptied, not just of the entity's immediate presence, but of something vital, something that had pulsed beneath its foundations for centuries. He found himself in the archive, the room that had been his sanctuary, his prison. The shelves of maps stood silent, reproachful. He sank into his worn leather chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. He was physically exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. He had seen the edges of reality fray, witnessed the impossible. He carried the indelible imprint of that vast, formless hunger. He was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. Who could he tell? Who would ever believe him? The world outside remained oblivious, cocooned in its fragile, comforting ignorance. He, Blake, was the only one who knew. The only one who remembered the taste of ozone and the sound of tearing reality. It was a vast, inky blackness, stretching further than any sky, deeper than any ocean. He felt its pressure, distant but palpable, a constant, subtle hum at the edge of his perception. The ritual had saved the world, perhaps, but it had irrevocably damned him. He remembered. He remembered the precise geometry of the ritual chambers hidden beneath the estate, the faint, metallic tang of the air in those unseen spaces, the way his grey-tance gaze had always seemed to hold a flicker of something ancient and knowing. He remembered the true purpose of the maps, not as guides to forgotten lands, but as intricate, delicate wards. The stone, now inert in his grasp, had been a key, a conduit, and a shield. It had shown him. Not visions, not images, but a cold, irrefutable understanding that settled into his bones like a terminal chill. His ancestors, the cartographers he had so admired, were not just guardians, they were jailers, custodians of a fragile peace, forever mapping the boundaries of a reality constantly threatened by something vast and indifferent. He didn't know how long he stayed there, a broken figure amidst the ancient relics. Eventually, a robed attendant found him, offering a quiet cup of bitter tea, their eyes holding a distant, almost pitying understanding. Blake said nothing, offered no explanation. There was none to give, none that wouldn't sound like the raving of a mind unhinged. The journey back to the estate was a blur, the landscape passing outside the coach window like a painted backdrop, devoid of real substance. The world had shifted on its axis, and he was no longer a part of its conventional spin. The estate, when he finally returned, felt different. It was no longer a grand, dusty repository of history. It was a living, breathing entity, a cage, a fortress, and a prison. The air inside hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, the very timbers of the house seeming to groan under an invisible weight. He went directly to the map room. The scent of aged parchment and dry ink, once a pleasant aroma, now carried a faint, coppery undertone, like old blood. He ran his fingers over the surface of the nearest celestial chart, the intricate constellations blurring before his eyes. They were not errors, they were warnings. He saw them now, not as mere lines on paper, but as conduits, as anchors, as the very seams of reality itself. Blake's routine became a ritual of vigilant despair. Every day, he would meticulously examine the maps, tracing the delicate lines, searching for the subtle shifts, the minute distortions that spoke of the entity's relentless pressure against the veil. He learned to listen to the house. The low groan of the ancient pipes in the walls was not just settling, it was a sigh. The wind whistling through the ill-fitting window frames was not just a draft, it was a breath. He began to perceive the cold spots in certain corners as the brush of an unseen presence, the sudden, inexplicable chill that would raise the hairs on his arms as a shadow cast by something immense, just beyond the edge of perception. He was no longer an archivist, he was a sentinel, a lonely keeper of the gate. The outside world faded. Visitors, when they rarely came, a distant cousin inquiring about a forgotten inheritance, a curious historian, found him distant, preoccupied, his responses clipped and vague. He offered no hospitality, no explanations. He simply wanted them gone, their mundane presence a dangerous distraction from his sacred, terrifying task. He knew, with a certainty that had carved itself into his soul, that the entity was still there, always there, pressing against the boundaries, its patience infinite, its hunger boundless. Blake was no longer the meticulous man who had arrived at the estate with a quiet sense of purpose. He was a man consumed, reshaped by the weight of an inherited horror. His life was now an endless vigil, a silent, desperate prayer against the inevitable. The impossible geographies would finally tear through the fragile fabric of the world he was sworn to protect. And he, the unwilling guardian, would be waiting.